So imagine you are sitting at the highest stakes poker table in the entire world.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right. We are talking about global intelligence, geopolitics, like literally the fate of nations.
The big leagues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And across the table from you, you've got the heavyweights, the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
The Five Eyes Alliance.
Right, the Five Eyes. And they were all secretly sharing their cards under the table.
Cooling their resources.
Yeah, they're playing as this massive synchronized team. But then, you look down at the very end of the table.
And there's just one player?
Just one player sitting entirely alone. And this player, outright, refuses to show their hand to anyone else.
And they won't rely on anyone else's chips either.
Exactly. And yet, somehow, time and time again, they're consistently winning major pots. And that lone player is France.
It's such a striking image, honestly, because it perfectly captures the fundamental isolation that France deliberately chooses in the global intelligence landscape. Like that refusal to show their hand. It isn't just stubbornness, it is a deeply calculated philosophical doctrine.
And it's a doctrine that completely upends how we usually think about modern alliances, right? I mean, we tend to assume that in the 21st century, democratic allies just share everything to survive.
That's the standard assumption, yeah.
But the reading we're doing our deep dive on today, Edward H. Whitmore's Shadow Intelligence Series, France, it argues the exact opposite.
It really does.
Whitmore reveals this French intelligence system that is built on a fierce, uncompromising concept called strategic autonomy.
Yes, strategic autonomy. That is the core of it all.
So our mission today is to unpack the DNA of that system. We're looking at how France uses espionage not just as like a defensive shield to stop threats, but as the actual load-bearing backbone of its global geopolitical influence.
And the Whitmore text is so essential for this because it forces us to look past the standard Anglo-American intelligence model.
Right, the model we're also used to.
Exactly. When you look at the NSA or GCHQ, the assumption is always that bigger is better, right? And that integration means safety.
Yeah.
But France looks at that exact same integration and they see an existential threat to their own sovereignty.
Which just feels completely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
To understand how they pull this off today, we got to understand why they view reliance on allies as a threat.
You have to go way back for that.
Right, reading through Whitmore's historical analysis, this isn't some new policy drafted in a Cold War boardroom. This obsession with sovereignty it's hardwired into their political DNA.
Very deeply hardwired.
Whitmore traces it all the way back to, like, the 1500s, right?
Yeah, we really have to look at the philosopher Jean Baudin and later on Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau.
Okay, bring us back to Philosophy 101.
So, Baudin laid down a principle that honestly still governs the Élysée Palace today. He argued that sovereign power must be indivisible.
Indivisible, like it can't be split up.
Exactly. It cannot be challenged by any internal faction, and it certainly cannot be subordinated to any external empire or alliance.
Gotcha.
Sovereignty isn't just about, drawing borders on a map and having a flag. It is about a supreme centralized state authority. The état.
The état. The ability to act decisively as one unified fist on behalf of the collective national will.
Precisely. And in that philosophical framework, intelligence is not just a government agency or some bureaucracy.
What is it then?
Intelligence is the unseen sentinel protecting that general will. It is the raw cognitive function of the sovereign state.
The brain of the state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the logic is simple but ruthless. If you rely on someone else for your intelligence, you are letting someone else's eyes dictate what your brain decides to do.
Oh, wow.
And if you do that, you are no longer sovereign.
That makes total sense in a philosophical enlightenment kind of way. But, reading the middle chapters of the sources, philosophies usually get tested by brutal reality.
They always do.
And the ultimate traumatic test of this idea wasn't a debate in a salon. It was 1940.
Yes, 1940. The fall of France to the German Blitzkrieg. That is the psychological crucible of modern French intelligence.
Because we usually just think of it as a military loss, right? The tanks just rolled in.
Right. We view 1940 purely as a military defeat. But Whitmore's analysis frames it as a catastrophic intelligence failure.
How so?
Well, the pre-war French intelligence apparatus, the Deuxième Bureau, it was incredibly fragmented.
It wasn't that unified fist.
Not at all. It was decentralized, totally crippled by intense bureaucratic rivalries between the army and the politicians.
Wait, so they had the information, but they just couldn't process it.
Pretty much. They saw the panzers amassing at the border. They had reports of German tactical shifts.
But nobody connected the dots.
Because the intelligence apparatus was not a unified sentinel serving a centralized state, the bureaucracy simply couldn't process the sheer speed of modern mechanized warfare.
The warnings just got lost in the paperwork.
Exactly. They died on the desks of competing departments.
Man. And the resulting trauma from that failure isn't just that they lost a battle, it's the occupation itself.
The occupation was a nightmare for them.
Right. It's the Vichy regime actively collaborating with the Nazis, effectively using the remaining intelligence tools of the state to hunt down their own citizens and the French resistance.
It was the ultimate betrayal of the État.
The entire concept of the État was shattered.
It was a total fracturing of national destiny. And so from the ashes of that fracture, you have Charles de Gaulle operating the Free French Forces out of London.
Right.
De Gaulle and his nascent intelligence network, the BCRA, they learned a bitter, permanent lesson about alliances during that time.
Because they couldn't do it alone.
No, they couldn't. To survive and fight back, they had to rely heavily on the British, specifically MI6 and the SOE, and later on the American OSS.
But instead of being grateful for the help, de Gaulle felt deeply humiliated by this, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because he realized the strategic trap they were in. If the British or Americans controlled the flow of information...
If they held all the cards.
Exactly. If London and Washington decided which resistance cells got weapons, or which train schedules were intercepted, or which German troop movements were shared...
Then London and Washington were basically controlling France's strategic choices.
Exactly. De Gaulle realized that outsourcing your eyes and ears meant ceding your national destiny.
So the trauma of having to essentially beg allies for the intelligence needed to take back their own country. That fundamentally rewired the bureaucratic brain of the French state.
They promised themselves.
Never again. Never again. And that trauma directly fueled their posture during the Cold War, which culminated in 1966, right at the height of the standoff between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Yes, 1966 is a pivotal year.
De Gaulle makes a move that just shocked the Western alliance. He withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command.
It was an earthquake in geopolitics.
I want to pause on that because the sheer audacity of doing that in 1966 is wild.
It's almost unthinkable.
Right. The Soviet Union's right next door, armed to the teeth, and France just says, actually, we're going to step out of the unified command structure.
It was seismic. But, from the French perspective, it was the ultimate necessary expression of Baudin's philosophy.
They had to walk the walk.
France actively chose to carve a middle path. They remained in the political alliance of the West, sure.
They didn't join the Soviets.
No. But they, point blank, refused to subordinate their military planning or their raw intelligence assessments to American or British oversight.
So this is the formal birth of the modern doctrine of strategic autonomy.
Exactly.
Which brings us to how they treat the Five Eyes today. Because, the Five Eyes, the U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they operate on a model of deep structural integration.
It's unprecedented integration.
They share massive amounts of raw signals data. They literally divide up the globe.
Right, they assign sectors.
Yeah. The NSA takes this hemisphere. GCHQ takes Europe and Russia. Australia handles the Pacific. They vacuum up petabytes of data and just pool it in the middle of the table.
And France looks at that massive pool and actively resists joining.
It's like refusing to join the ultimate group project because you'll end up doing the work their way. And instead, you just decide to build your own multi-billion-dollar tech company from scratch.
That's a great way to put it, because joining would mean integration, and to them, integration means dependency.
Right.
France views intelligence as a core pillar of independent statecraft. It is not a potluck where everyone brings a dish.
But they do talk to each other, right? It's not a total blackout.
Now, we should be clear, sharing does occur between France and the Five Eyes, but Whitmore emphasizes that it is always a controlled, pragmatic, transactional exchange.
Like I give you a specific dossier on a terror suspect in Mali, you give me satellite imagery of a port in the Pacific.
Exactly that. It is a barter system.
Tit for tat.
Right. It is never a wholesale integration of databases, and it is never allowed to become a structural dependency where France forgets how to gather that intelligence themselves.
Okay, but hold on. We're in the 21st century. The NSA and GCHQ are intercepting internet backbone cables.
They are.
They are vacuuming up planetary levels of data. By walking away from the Five Eyes, isn't France just, like, blinding itself out of sheer national pride?
It's a huge risk.
I mean, how can you possibly maintain situational awareness when you refuse to plug into the biggest data machine ever built?
Well, the French agencies are highly aware of this limitation. They aren't naive. They know they risk massive blind spots.
So how do they deal with that?
They know they cannot intercept every digital packet on Earth the way the Five Eyes attempt to do, so they compensate by completely changing their operational calculus.
What do you mean?
They over-index heavily on targeted human intelligence, and deep, hyper-local regional expertise.
So fewer server farms, more actual spies in the room.
Exactly. They accept that they won't have the broad digital dragnet. Instead, they focus intensely on placing human operatives right where the decisions are being made.
Getting in the room where it happens.
Right. They rely on profound cultural and linguistic immersion, particularly in francophone regions of the world where an American or British operative might really struggle to blend in.
Or grasp the local tribal nuances, right?
Exactly. They accept the massive financial and operational burden of doing it entirely themselves, because the alternative subordination to Washington or London violates their core philosophy.
But the Whitmore text points out that strategic autonomy isn't just about deploying human spies.
No, it's about hardware, too.
Right. If you want to be truly independent in the modern era, you need technological sovereignty.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Think about the actual hardware and software used in espionage today.
Okay.
If French intelligence buys its encryption software from an American tech giant, or if they launch their spy satellites using foreign rockets.
Then their autonomy is just an illusion.
Exactly.
Because if push comes to shove, the country that built the tech can just flip a kill switch. Or worse, they could use built-in backdoors to spy on the spies.
That is their nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
So France partners with its own massive, heavily state-backed domestic giants. Companies like Thales and Airbus Defense and Space.
Keeping it in-house.
Keeping it entirely domestic. They are pouring billions into building their own quantum-resistant cryptography.
Okay, let's break that down, because quantum-resistant cryptography sounds like sci-fi jargon. Why is France so obsessed with owning this specific tech?
Well, standard encryption, the kind that currently protects military communications, banking, basically everything.
Yeah.
That relies on incredibly complex math problems that would take traditional computers millions of years to solve.
Right.
But quantum computers operate on a totally different level of physics. A mature quantum computer could theoretically solve those math problems in seconds.
Wait, seconds. Meaning all current secrets suddenly become open books.
Yes, it's a ticking clock. If the United States or China develops a functioning quantum computer first, and France is relying on older, shared Western encryption standards,
then French sovereignty evaporates overnight.
Exactly. So French companies like Thales are building new mathematical fortresses, quantum-resistant algorithms, entirely in-house.
And they are doing the exact same thing in space. The sources mention CNES, the French space agency.
Right.
They aren't just hitching rides on SpaceX or NASA rockets to save a buck.
Absolutely not. They insist on launching their own secure military communications satellites using the European Ariane rocket family.
Launched from French Guiana.
Yes. And they are developing bespoke, homegrown cyber warfare tools. They absolutely refuse to use off-the-shelf foreign tech for any core security function.
Which has to be so expensive.
It is incredibly expensive and resource-intensive for a country the size of France to duplicate what the U.S. already has.
They do it anyway.
Because it ties back to Jean Baudin. If the sovereign state does not control the microchip, the state is not sovereign.
Okay, so they are building this massive, centralized, shadowy intelligence apparatus. And it relies heavily on extreme operational secrecy.
Very extreme.
They answer to no one internationally.
Right.
Which sounds like a fantastic setup for, like, an absolute monarch.
Right.
But France is a modern democratic republic. The citizens of France are historically terrified of unchecked state power.
They've had the revolutions for a reason.
Exactly. So how on earth does the French government balance this demand for absolute shadowy autonomy with the transparency demanded by an open society?
You're hitting on what Whitmore defines as the democratic paradox of French intelligence.
The democratic paradox.
It is a defining internal friction of their system. On one hand, the doctrine of strategic autonomy requires extreme secrecy, right? Compartmentalization and direct executive control by the President of the Republic.
The intelligence agencies must be able to act ruthlessly and quietly.
Exactly. But on the other hand, you have a French public that remembers the Gestapo. They remember the abuses of the Vichy regime.
The trauma is still there.
Very much so. And they have a cultural reflex to protest and demand accountability from their leaders.
And throughout the late 20th century, this internal friction actually ignited into massive public scandals, didn't it?
It did. Because the intelligence apparatus, operating with very little oversight, inevitably turned its tools inward.
It's the classic spy agency pitfall.
The most prominent example Whitmore analyzes is the Affaire des Écoutes, the wiretapping affair, which unfolded in the 1980s under President François Mitterrand.
Okay, what were the actual mechanics of that scandal? Because we hear wiretapping, and we usually just think of standard police work, like busting a mafia boss.
Yeah.
But this was something else entirely.
This was a profound abuse of the Sentinel concept. Mitterrand created a special anti-terrorism cell within the Élysée Palace, ostensibly to protect the state from external threats.
Sounds reasonable on paper.
Right, but the executive branch quietly directed this massive intelligence cell to illegally surveil a vast array of domestic targets who posed zero national security risk.
Wait, really? Who were they targeting?
Political rivals, prominent journalists, lawyers, even celebrities. Anyone who might uncover political embarrassments or personal secrets of the president. They used the absolute pinnacle of state espionage technology to monitor domestic political opponents and manage the media narrative.
That is the exact nightmare scenario.
It really is.
It proves the public's fear. Without oversight, the tools designed to protect the state will eventually just be used to protect the politicians currently in power.
And when the investigative press finally exposed the Affaire des Écoutes, it just shattered public trust.
I can imagine.
It validated every historical fear the French public harbored about a secret police operating in the shadows of the Republic. It forced a massive reckoning.
So how did the state react? They obviously didn't just dismantle the intelligence agencies because the geopolitical threats were still real. The Soviets were still there.
Right, they couldn't just turn off the lights, so they were forced to thread a very difficult needle. They had to introduce institutional reforms to appease the public without castrating the agency's ability to operate autonomously.
A tightrope walk.
And they knew they couldn't adopt the American model. You know, like the church committee hearings where intelligence directors are grilled on live television by Congress.
Right, because that kind of wide-open public transparency would totally violate the French need for strict operational secrecy.
Exactly. So what does French oversight actually look like?
Yeah, how do they do it?
They developed specialized closed-door bodies. For example, they created the CNCIS, the National Commission for the Control of Security Interceptions.
Okay.
If an agency wants to tap a phone or intercept data, they have to go through a strict authorization process that involves independent magistrates.
So there is a legal hurdle.
Yes. And later, they created parliamentary intelligence delegations.
The lawmakers do get to see what's going on, but they are sworn to secrecy. It's a compromise.
It is a perpetually shifting equilibrium. The media and civil rights groups continually push for more transparency.
Naturally.
And the intelligence agencies constantly push back. They argue that excessive oversight exposes human sources, reveals fragile cyber methods, and ultimately leads to operational failure.
That covers the friction inside France. But Whitmore's text shifts into an even more volatile arena, right? The external friction.
Yes, the international stage.
The tension between covert espionage and formal public diplomacy.
This dynamic is fascinating because it involves two completely different arms of the French state operating simultaneously in foreign capitals, often at total cross purposes.
Right, so you have the diplomatic corps, the ambassadors, the envoys at the UN. They operate in the light.
Yeah.
Their job is adherence to international law, formal treaties, and maintaining smooth bilateral relations.
And then operating in the exact same city, you have the DGSE, the Directorate General for External Security.
And they are operating in the absolute shadows.
Running spy rings, intercepting emails, bribing officials, and conducting covert actions.
It's such a wild contrast. To understand how they interact, it's like, forget the old cliche of a swan gliding on a lake while paddling furiously underneath.
Okay, what's a better analogy?
Think of French foreign policy as a beautifully tailored, bespoke suit.
I like this.
The diplomacy is the visible fabric. It's elegant, adhering to the rules of high society, designed to impress and negotiate.
Right.
But underneath that fabric Sewn directly into the lining is a Kevlar vest, and that vest is the DGSE.
That's spot on.
The suit makes the interactions possible, but the Kevlar provides the raw, hard power that allows the diplomat to actually stand their ground.
That's brilliant. So intelligence isn't working against diplomacy, it's the raw material for it.
Exactly the opposite of working against it.
Imagine a French ambassador walking into a high-stakes negotiation with a foreign nation over a critical minerals trade deal.
Okay, picture the scene.
Because the DGSE has already compromised the communications of the foreign delegation, the French ambassador already knows the foreign leader's bottom line before they even sit down.
They know exactly how far they can push before the other side walks away.
They know which rival political factions are pressuring that foreign leader behind closed doors. They know if that government is secretly negotiating a better deal with China on the side.
It's like playing poker, but you can see everyone else's cards.
Exactly. The diplomat walks into the room holding the opponent's playbook. Intelligence allows French diplomats to probe the reliability of their partners and negotiate from a position of profound asymmetric advantage.
But the sources highlight the massive inherent risk here. What happens when the Kevlar vest is exposed?
Things get messy.
Right. What happens when a DGSE covert operation goes wrong? Say, a sabotage mission leaves forensic evidence, or a spy ring is rolled up by a friendly nation's counterintelligence.
The blowback is immediate and severe. Suddenly, the elegant diplomatic suit is covered in mud.
The host nation expels the diplomats.
Paris is forced to engage in rapid, humiliating damage control.
But wait, when a massive diplomatic scandal hits the front pages because a spy got caught, does the French state ever actually rein in the intelligence agencies?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Or is a public apology from the ambassador just like diplomatic theater while the DGSE goes right back to work?
It is so easy to dismiss it as theater. But Whitmore argues the consequences are real. A blown operation genuinely harms France's strategic interests.
How so?
It damages their soft power, their cultural and diplomatic influence, and crucially, it erodes trust with essential allies who might now view France as a liability.
So it's a measurable loss of real power.
Yes. A loss of trust means foreign governments lock France out of sensitive negotiations.
Which defeats the whole purpose.
Exactly. To prevent this, the DGSE maintains a robust internal political advisory capacity. They actually embed political analysts directly within the operational planning teams.
Really? So there's, like, a guy in the room while they're planning a hack whose only job is to say, is this worth it?
They act as the political compass. They constantly calculate the risk matrix. They ask, if this cyber infiltration is traced back to Paris, is the intelligence we gain worth the diplomatic fallout of alienating this specific ally?
That's a tough calculation.
It is. And they actively veto operations that could do irreparable damage to France's international standing.
Now, there's another dynamic Whitmore covers that I found completely wild. Back-channeling.
Ah, yes. Back channels.
The idea that sometimes public diplomacy is completely frozen, but the intelligence services keep a backdoor wide open.
This is a classic application of strategic autonomy, and Whitmore uses a striking historical case study for this. South Africa in the 1980s, during the height of apartheid.
So publicly, the French government, like the rest of the international community, was formally condemning the apartheid regime.
They had to.
The public diplomacy was icy, sanctions were being enforced, the tailored suit was showing extreme disapproval.
But underneath the fabric, the intelligence channels were kept discreetly but highly actively open. Yes. The DGSE maintained direct communications with South African intelligence and security authorities.
Which seems incredibly hypocritical. Why violate your own public diplomatic stance?
Well, from a pure realpolitik perspective, it provided Paris with ultimate strategic flexibility outside the glare of public scrutiny.
Okay, explain that.
France had massive economic and strategic interests across the African continent. If the situation in southern Africa shifted rapidly, if the regime fell, or if a broader regional war broke out.
They needed to be ready.
Exactly. France still had human assets, deep intelligence sharing, and open lines of communication on the ground.
So they weren't blinded by their own moral grandstanding.
They ensured they could manage any transition on their own terms without having to rely on the US or the UK to tell them what was happening in Pretoria.
Fascinating. So, okay, we've established the philosophy of strategic autonomy. We've explored the internal democratic friction and the external diplomatic tightropes.
All the theory.
Right. But all of these theories are just abstract concepts until they hit the ground. And Whitmore makes it explicitly clear that the ultimate proving ground for this entire philosophy The place where the Kevlar vest is tested daily is the continent of Africa.
Yes. If you want to understand the mechanics of French intelligence, you absolutely must understand their operations in Africa.
It's ground zero.
But before we look at the geography, we need to clearly define the tools they bring to the fight. We've mentioned a few acronyms, but the system relies on an integrated architecture known as the operational triad.
Okay, let's break down the triad. Who's first?
First, as we discussed, is the DGSE, the Directorate General for External Security. They operate entirely outside of France.
The spies?
Right. They are responsible for external espionage, deploying human operatives, recruiting foreign assets, and conducting covert paramilitary and cyber actions.
They are the tip of the spear. Who's second?
Second is the DGSI, the Directorate General for Internal Security. They are the shield.
So they stay home.
They operate strictly within French borders. Their mandate is counterintelligence, catching foreign spies, and counterterrorism, tracking radicalized individuals and preventing attacks on the homeland.
Got it. And the third pillar?
The DRM, the Directorate of Military Intelligence. They are not running spies in cafes. They handle battlefield analysis.
The tech guys.
They manage the satellites, the reconnaissance drones, the tactical signals intelligence. They exist to support the deployment of the French armed forces.
Okay, but with three massive, highly secretive bureaucracies, how do you prevent them from hoarding information or, like, accidentally stepping on each other's toes in the field?
That falls to a central coordinating body called the OCCR, the Office Central de Coordination Renseignement.
What's their role?
Think of them as the central nervous system. Their job is to forcefully break down the silos and ensure that the DGSE spies, the DGSI's domestic wiretaps, and the DRM's satellite imagery are all fused into a single, coherent intelligence picture for the president.
Okay, I see. DGC outside, DGSI inside, DRM for the military, all synchronized by the OCCR.
That's the triad.
So how does this triad deploy across Africa? Whitmore dedicates a huge portion of the text to the legacy of Françafrique.
Yes, Françafrique. This refers to the deep, complex, and honestly highly controversial web of political, economic, and security ties that France maintained with its former African colonies long after they gained formal independence in the 1960s.
And we are talking about a massive historical footprint here. Colonial-era administrative networks, deeply ingrained informant systems, linguistic ties.
When the physical French Empire ended and the flags came down, the French intelligence networks did not just pack up their bags and leave.
They stayed behind.
They seamlessly transitioned. The local informants who used to report to colonial administrators simply began reporting to DGSE handlers.
Oh, wow.
The cultural knowledge, the intimate understanding of regional tribal dynamics, the linguistic fluency in local dialects, all of that historical infrastructure was repurposed into arguably the most effective modern human intelligence network on the continent.
It's an unparalleled advantage. Other powers are trying to, like, pick the lock to get inside, but France is operating in an old house that they built themselves.
That is exactly it.
They still hold the original blueprints, they know where all the secret passages are, and they know which floorboards creak.
That is the perfect analogy for their operational advantage. When the United States, China, or Russia attempts to build intelligence networks in Africa, they are starting from scratch.
Right.
They struggle with cultural barriers and historical blind spots. France relies on this legacy architecture to blend into the socio-political environment almost invisibly.
And this advantage isn't just invisible networks of informants either. They have actual physical real estate to support the triad.
Strategic geography is incredibly crucial. France maintains enduring military bases and intelligence hubs in highly sensitive locations. A prime example on the West Coast is Senegal.
Okay.
But the absolute crown jewel for intelligence gathering is on the East Coast, Djibouti.
Looking at a map, Djibouti is tiny, but its location is just absurdly valuable.
It is a critical geopolitical choke point right at the Horn of Africa, overlooking the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Right.
From their sovereign base in Djibouti, French military and intelligence assets can physically monitor all maritime traffic moving between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean.
So they can see everything heading toward the Suez Canal.
Yes, every single ship. They can intercept regional signals traffic across the Middle East and East Africa.
Just vacuuming it up.
And crucially, it gives them a front row seat to monitor the expanding, aggressive military footprints of both China and the United States, who also have bases nearby.
Which perfectly serves the doctrine of strategic autonomy. If France wants to know how many Chinese naval vessels are transiting the Red Sea, they don't have to formally request a briefing from the CIA.
Nope.
They just look out the window and analyze their own DRM data.
Exactly. It's independence in action. But to see how this triad works at its absolute most lethal peak, Whitmore takes us deep into the Sahel region.
The Sahel, the vast, arid, brutal stretch of territory just south of the Sahara Desert. Countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso.
Starting around 2013, the Sahel became the front line in a massive, sprawling fight against jihadist insurgencies.
Heavily armed groups linked to al-Qaeda and ISIS who were threatening to topple state governments.
Yes. France launched massive military interventions to stop them, notably Operation Serval, which later morphed into Operation Barkhane.
But Whitmore makes a crucial distinction here. France didn't just blindly drop paratroopers into the desert and hope for the best.
Not at all. For years prior to the first soldier stepping off a transport plane, the DGSE and the DRM had been operating in the shadows of the Sahel.
Using the old house blueprints.
Exactly. They had been utilizing those networks.
What were they actually doing before the war started?
They were mapping the battle space. DGSE operatives cultivated deep contacts with local Tuareg tribal leaders. They tracked the ancient smuggling routes used for weapons and human trafficking.
Preparing the ground.
Right. They infiltrated the logistical networks of the extremist groups long before the crisis exploded.
So when the military was finally called in to stop the jihadist advance on the capital of Mali, they already held the target list.
Exactly. Intelligence provided the necessary precision. Instead of fighting a blind, sprawling Vietnam-style counterinsurgency, French forces could execute targeted surgical strikes based on fused intelligence.
There is a specific, gripping case study in Whitmore's text that details the mechanics of this. The targeting of Mokhtar Belmokhtar in 2016.
Oh, the hunt for Belmokhtar. He was a notorious, highly elusive senior figure in al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQM.
A very bad guy.
Extremely dangerous. He had orchestrated mass kidnappings and devastating terrorist attacks, including the In Amenas hostage crisis. Finding one man who knows how to hide in the immensity of the Saharan desert is a staggering intelligence challenge.
You are literally looking for a needle in 1,000,000 square miles of sand. How do you mechanically track a ghost?
You deploy the entire triad, step by step. First, the DGSE utilized its deep human networks.
Human intelligence.
Right. A local tribal contact, motivated by either money or rivalries, provides a whisper. A rumor of a convoy moving through a specific wadi.
So it always starts with human intelligence.
Almost always. But human intelligence is often delayed or imprecise. You can't call an airstrike on a rumor. So the DGSE pivots to signals intelligence.
Electronic ears.
They use specialized equipment to intercept the faint VHF radio bounces or satellite phone bursts coming from that specific sector of the desert.
They match the whisper to a digital signature.
Yes. Once they have an approximate digital location, they pass the coordinates to the DRM.
The military intelligence arm.
Exactly. The DRM then deploys its high-tech assets, like the Atlantique II Maritime Patrol aircraft, which are packed with incredible sensory equipment, or Reaper drones.
Eyes in the sky.
The DRM uses thermal imaging and high-resolution cameras to positively verify the target from the sky.
And once the target is painted, the military moves in.
Once the intelligence is fused and confirmed, French Special Operations Forces execute a rapid, decisive raid. That seamless chain from a tribal informant's whisper to an electronic intercept to a satellite image to a kinetic strike is the French intelligence machine working perfectly.
It's terrifyingly efficient. Now, Whitmore details another operation that shows a totally different, much more modern toolkit. Let's look at the Central African Republic Operation Sangaris, operating roughly between 2013 and 2017.
The Sangaris was a completely different operational environment. France was dealing with severe, chaotic civil conflict, ethnic cleansing, and highly mobile rebel factions like the Seleka.
It was chaos.
Complete chaos. And instead of just relying on troops on the ground, the DGSE launched a highly sophisticated, covert cyber operation.
Hold on. How do you even pull off a cyber attack in the middle of a war-torn country with barely any digital infrastructure? I mean, we aren't talking about hacking a Silicon Valley server farm here.
It requires extreme tactical innovation. The rebel commanders were relying heavily on specific communications infrastructure, often stolen commercial cell networks, VHF radios, or VS-8 satellite phones.
Okay.
The DGSE's cyber command didn't need to hack the internet. They needed to blind the local network.
How do you blind a network in the jungle?
By actively jamming the specific radio frequencies the rebels used to coordinate attacks. by compromising the local cell towers to intercept SMS messages, or even spoofing those networks to send fake deployment orders to confuse the rebel leadership.
Wait, they were sending fake tests?
Yes, they systematically dismantled the enemy's command and control capabilities from the inside out.
So the rebel commanders are suddenly cut off, receiving fake orders, unable to talk to their troops. That's wild.
Exactly. And while the rebels were blinded by the cyber attack, the DRM combined that electronic warfare with high-resolution satellite mapping to locate the isolated rebel concentrations.
Trapping them.
This allowed French peacekeeping forces to intervene with extreme, localized precision, disarming the factions while minimizing collateral damage to the civilian population.
It's a hybrid war. You have an operative talking to an informant in a village square, while a satellite takes photos from space, and a DGSE hacker in Paris shuts down a local radio network.
It's the triad at work. And we cannot forget the domestic implication of all this activity. The intelligence gathered in the sands of the Sahel or the jungles of the Sahara does not stay in Africa.
Right, it connects back home. Whitmore pivots to the domestic impact, specifically the tracking of the Charlie Hebdo plot in 2012.
This is a tragic but vital analysis of why the DGSE, the external spies, and the DGSI, the internal shield, must coordinate flawlessly.
Because it's all connected.
In 2012, 3 years before the horrific terrorist attacks on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, French intelligence had already begun tracking the plot.
How did they connect the dots years in advance?
It was a fusion of internal and external data. The DGSI was actively monitoring radicalized individuals domestically within the borders of France. They noticed suspicious activities and associations. But it was the DGSE's external networks operating in the Sahel and tracking movements into Syria and Yemen that uncovered the operational links.
The DGSE saw where these domestic suspects were going.
Yes. The DGSC tracked the encrypted communications and the physical travel routes connecting the suspects in Paris to jihadist training camps and command structures abroad. They mapped the transatlantic web.
Which proves the absolute necessity of the OCCR coordinating body. The threat wasn't purely domestic, and it wasn't purely foreign. It was a single, fluid network that ignored borders.
Exactly. It highlighted that the defense of the état requires total synchronization.
Okay, all of this sounds incredibly effective on paper. The operations are slick, the technology is advanced, but we need to look at the reality on the ground today.
The reality is shifting quickly.
Right, Whitmore explicitly details a massive rising tide of backlash against France across the African continent. We're talking about relying on colonial-era ghost networks, playing kingmaker in African politics, running shadow wars.
It's catching up to them.
There are widespread, furious accusations of neocolonialism. And simultaneously, you have Russia and China aggressively moving in.
The geopolitical landscape has shifted violently against them in the last few years.
Russia's Wagner Group is offering brutal security assistance without any lectures on human rights. China is pouring billions into infrastructure without asking for democratic reforms.
It's fierce competition.
How long can France realistically rely on these old house blueprints before the house just burns down? Before this legacy becomes a massive liability?
You have identified the exact crisis point that French intelligence is grappling with at this very moment.
It's at a turning point.
The historical model of France-Afrique is under unprecedented strain. The old informant networks are fraying, and a new generation of African leaders and citizens are actively rejecting French influence.
I mean, we've seen the military coup in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, where the first thing the new juntas do is expel the French military and the French ambassadors.
Exactly. So the French intelligence apparatus is facing a stark choice. Do they pack up and abandon their strategic depth in Africa?
They can't, because that violates strategic autonomy.
Precisely. If they leave, they lose their independent eyes and ears, so they have to pivot. French intelligence realizes they can no longer rely purely on historical momentum or colonial-era debts to maintain their access.
They need a new pitch.
They are having to prove their ongoing, indispensable value to these nations.
How do you prove your value when the local populations are burning the French flag in the streets?
By offering highly advanced, modernized capabilities that these African nations desperately need to survive, but lack the resources to build themselves. France is shifting its posture from, we will fight your wars for you, to, we will build your capacity to fight.
What does that look like mechanically?
It looks like the DGSE and DGSI providing allied African intelligence services with state-of-the-art training in counter-cyber terrorism.
Upgrading their tech.
It means teaching them how to track illicit digital financial flows used by insurgents. It means providing them with advanced signals interception equipment and the training to use it.
Ah, it's a technical lifeline. Don't kick us out and rely on Russian mercenaries because we can teach you how to hack your enemies and track terrorist financing.
Exactly. They are trying to transition the relationship from one of historical dependence to one of indispensable technical partnership.
It's a rebrand.
It is a desperate, high-stakes race to secure their strategic autonomy in a region where they are suddenly facing fierce, well-funded competition from Moscow and Beijing.
Okay, let's take a step back and look at the whole board here.
Right.
We've seen how France philosophically refuses to join the Five Eyes.
Right.
We've seen the precarious tightrope they walk between democratic transparency and shadowy state secrecy. We've explored the tension between the elegant suit of diplomacy and the Kevlar vest of espionage. And we've seen how they deploy this massive integrated intelligence machine, the triad, across Africa to fight terrorists and fiercely protect their interests. It seems crystal clear from Whitmore's text that none of this is just a quirky French way of doing things.
Not at all. It is a highly rational, cohesive system.
These are the deliberate, calculated blueprints of a nation that is fighting tooth and nail to retain its seat at the head table of global power.
And if we look at the broader geopolitical implications, France's unique intelligence posture is the silent force multiplier that underwrites its sovereignty.
It's the engine of their power.
By maintaining strategic autonomy, by owning its own satellites, its own cryptography, and its own human networks, France projects power far beyond what its geographic size or its economic GDP would normally dictate.
They punch massively above their weight class because they see things others don't, and they see them entirely independently.
They serve as a crucial, independent power broker. Think about the current state of the world. It is increasingly polarizing into a strict, tense binary between the United States and China.
Right, you're either on one team or the other.
But France, through its autonomous intelligence capabilities, offers other nations a third option.
An alternative alliance.
Yes, an alliance that comes with top-tier nuclear-armed intelligence capabilities, but without the absolute demands of Washington or the economic strings of Beijing.
That is a massive paradigm shift in how we view global power. And for you listening, understanding this dynamic completely changes how you should read the global news.
It really does.
Tomorrow, when you see a headline about a diplomatic summit happening in Paris, or you read a tiny blurb about a sudden military shift in West Africa, or a new tech contract being signed in the Sahel, you now know what's happening beneath the surface.
You see the Kevlar vests.
Exactly. You know about the DGSE operatives mapping the desert, the DGSI protecting the homeland, and the DRM guiding the satellites. You understand the invisible machinery pulling the levers.
Intelligence is the unseen dimension of history. And in France's case, it is the uncompromising dimension that guarantees their independence.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Yeah.
Something that builds on everything Whitmore wrote about technology and independence.
Okay.
France insists on building its own tech to remain autonomous. They spend billions building their own satellites, their own quantum cryptography, their own cyber weapons.
Right.
But look at where technology is heading. We are entering the age of artificial general intelligence and true quantum computing. These are technologies that require trillions of dollars in investment.
A whole new scale.
They require massive, planetary-scale global supply chains and the combined computing power of entire hemispheres.
The scale of the next technological leap is entirely unprecedented in human history.
Exactly. So the ultimate question is, can any single nation, no matter how proud, no matter how historically powerful or philosophically committed to Bodin's, truly afford to buy its own autonomy in the future?
That's a chilling thought.
Or is strategic autonomy destined to become an illusion in the quantum age? When the buy-in at the global poker table gets into the trillions of dollars, can France really afford to keep playing entirely alone?
That is the existential question facing not just French intelligence, but the very concept of the sovereign nation-state itself in the 21st century.
Something to mull over the next time you look at the geopolitical poker table. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shadows of French intelligence. We'll see you next time as we explore the next stack of sources.